Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, hello everyone. To those watching online, hello. We're streaming from the Cascade Hermitage, and this is part of the weekend retreat we're doing here. So I think we have another 2 live streamed talks today. And the subject of the retreat is the Mindfulness of Breathing sutta, so the Ānāpānasati sutta. And this is one of the most famous discourses. The Buddha said that the breath is the abode of the Tathagata, which is the epithet that he used to refer to himself. So it comes highly recommended. And I was listening to a podcast recently, because monks also listen to podcasts some. And it was an interview with a woman who wrote a book called The Philosophical Baby, and it was about how the minds of infants are open and intelligent in a way that's hard for us to understand as adults, where our minds and our capacity to learn have been so constricted and constrained. And really what she does is hold up this mind state of learning as profoundly important and something we should value and not dismiss as sort of this childish phase. And what's interesting is that really intelligent animals tend to have a long phase of this, where their minds are in this sort of learning area, with the exception of octopi. And the reason apparently is that octopi have their nervous system spread through their entire body, so their tentacles are always in this learning mode, and they're always kind of feeling things, whereas their main brain and their sort of central brain is much more directing things, but they sort of straddle both this awareness of the infant and the very focused awareness of the adult. And what she was pointing to, she'd worked a lot with artificial intelligence, was the fact that these 2 types of awareness, which I think many people might have heard of, are frequently described as lantern awareness versus spotlight awareness. And in the West, we have become extremely good at spotlight awareness, so narrowing one's focus to one point, one screen. And when we think of, there's a concept in Buddhism called samadhi, or unification of mind, concentration. And naturally that word tends to bring to mind someone furrowing their brow and really concentrating on some subject. And this is spotlight awareness, as it's automatically intuited by most of us Western-minded folk. And this makes a lot of sense. So much of our awareness is visual. We're always reading or moving in straight lines down, say, a street. Our focus is extremely heady. I referenced this line yesterday, but there's a great line in the Dubliners that Ajahn references, where he says that Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body, viewing his actions and thoughts with suspicious sidelong glances. And this is very much what we do. So we're very alienated from our bodies, and we're also very focused and with a very narrow scope of awareness. And this has been very significant because it's meant that as samadhi practice, as this practice of bringing the mind to calm and focus has been brought to the West and translated, it has been translated as concentration. And even the techniques that have been used to supposedly cultivate it have very much focused on the spotlight awareness. So bring your mind to one point, say the tip of the nose, and just follow the breath there and don't move. And if the mind kind of wanders off, you bring it back and just remain with that. And eventually something will click and you'll sort of spring into this state of luminosity. And this way of trying to focus works for some people, but for many it does not. And when you think of what unification of mind meant in the Buddha's time, when people lived in the forest, when you're in the forest and you're concentrated, it doesn't mean you're concentrated on one thing. You're aware of the whole field of awareness because something could be coming to eat you at any time. So as soon as you narrow awareness to one object, then suddenly you've compromised yourself immensely because you've cut off every other of the 359 other degrees out there, and you're just focused on one degree. So increasingly, the idea of samadhi, unification of mind, has not been translated as concentration, but as unification of mind, as this sort of broad awareness. And this is much more akin to lantern awareness, say of a child, perhaps. So this speaks to an interesting point in that the first steps of the Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta, which the Buddha really taught as one of his main routes to concentration, to a still mind. First of all, it begins by, there's 16 steps, and they're divided into 4 tetrads, or groups of 4, each of which correspond to a different foundation of mindfulness, which is another teaching, and we don't have to go into it completely right now. It's a lot. But suffice it to say that the first 4 steps focus on the body. So, and this sutta is supposed to, this teaching is supposed to be enough to bring one all the way to liberation, and it's extremely powerful. So the first step is mindfully, one breathes in knowing, one breathes in long knowing I breathe in long. One breathes in short knowing I breathe in short. One breathes out short knowing I breathe out short. That's one step. The second step is one breathes in long knowing I breathe in long. One breathes out long knowing I breathe out long. So this first 2 steps are how we can begin meditation in terms of really noting the length of the breath and also trying to adjust it so that it's comfortable. And another one of the difficult things with how meditation practice has been brought to the West is this admonition to just be with your breath naturally and not control it. But because we're neurotic, overly thinking people, at least I am, then the direction to not control your breath, you try to control yourself to not control the breath. And it's as if we're such controlling creatures that that tendency to control, when you tell yourself not to control, just moves under the surface. And that's when the breath becomes tight and things become confused. And in some ways, it's much better if you're coming in with a lot of momentum and thinking, just to work with that tendency to control. So very consciously, try to adjust the breath so that it's light or heavy or long or short, depending on what you feel is comfortable. So if you're feeling really lethargic, then you can make your in-breath emphasized and longer, and that'll energize the body. Or if you're feeling really agitated, then giving yourself a long, relaxed exhale, it can be what lets the body relax. And similarly, because you're noting the length of these breaths or their lightness or their heaviness, then it's a very concrete way to tether the mind to its object and give it stability at the beginning. And this is actually somewhat spotlight concentration at first. And that's because usually we come into the meditation with a spotlight awareness already. So you might as well use it at first and aim it on the right thing, which is the breath. The third step of the Ānāpānasati Sutta, the mindfulness of breathing teaching, is to One trains thus, I will breathe in, experiencing the whole body. One trains thus, I will breathe out, experiencing the whole body. And in the years after the Buddha's life, this instruction became interpreted as one breathes in and out, aware of the whole body of the breath, the length of the breath at one point, say the tip of the nose. And this is where so many of these instructions around just narrowing your focus to one point and just sticking with it at that point come from. And it works for some people, but I use this analogy a lot. It's a bit like taking a classroom full of screaming second graders and telling them to sit down and be quiet and do a test. It doesn't always work, and it can be a pretty joyless and unpleasant experience for everyone involved. So what is increasingly becoming the mode of practice that I've seen taught and that scholarship has pointed to the Buddha actually teaching has been interpreting the whole body as just that, the whole body, and of the breath not as the coarse wind at the nose, but rather this sort of subtle energy that flows through the body. Frequently, it'll flow along what are called the meridians. So up the spine and down the front of the body, or up the front of the body and down the spine. So what this means is that one, instead of narrowing one's focus to a spotlight, one keeps or aims towards more of a lantern awareness that encompasses the whole body in this wide scope. That being said, initially it can be hard to get to that spot right away. And in this interview I was referencing, this woman referenced a third type of consciousness that almost never gets spoken to, which is the consciousness of play. And that when children are in a state of play or adults are in a state of watching a movie, their minds click into a whole different state, which is enjoyable and engaged, but it's also moving, it's engaging, it's thinking. And this state of play is really important because it's a bit like, because us Westerners think of so often our bodies as these things, as Ajahn puts it, that keep our necks from scraping along the ground. The chance to drop from the tight, narrow focus where most of us, in the head, where most of us live our lives, with a constrained diaphragm that kind of squeezes awareness up. The direction to drop awareness into the whole bodily frame and reacquaint ourselves with our bodies and the somatic sense, it doesn't happen necessarily immediately or easily. So in some of the guided meditations I gave earlier this morning, not the one we just did, which was more on metta and loving kindness, but one can really use playful means of sort of playing and exploring the body in a playful way to kind of work with the awareness to drop it. So this is where visualizations such as dividing the body into 3 chambers, one above from the neck to the top of the head, one from the neck to the diaphragm, and then one from about the diaphragm down to the tailbone. One establishes awareness in the upper chamber around the head and breathes there for a time and feels what sensations are there. And one can visualize a bright ball of light expanding and contracting with the breath, or one can visualize the breath as sort of a white mist expanding and contracting through the pores. And then one lets the awareness drop to the second chamber and stays there for a time, and then the third. And then after moving around all 3, one expands awareness to encompass the whole body, from the crown of the head to the tailbone, but also allowing the awareness to come to one point where the breath is especially prominent, usually the tip of the nose, and to rest or center there, but remain aware of the whole field of the body at the same time, like a spider resting at the center of a web, but aware of the whole web, or like a lantern, where the center's bright, but you see all around. And there's a lot of other visualizations that one can use to kind of cultivate this full-bodied awareness. One can imagine a bowl of butter melting down the neck and down into the body to sort of bring awareness down. One can do some qigong, go for a jog, cold shower. I always recommend. No one ever takes me up on it, or some people might. But any expedient means to drop the awareness into the torso. Because this practice of reacquainting oneself with the body and with the whole body of the breath, it's not some esoteric or dry instruction. The intuitive awareness, what we call in Buddhism the citta, which is the mind or the heart, there's not really a distinction in Buddhist terminology. It rests in the heart. That's just in the body where it tends to be accessed. And I think one of the most sad things is how when we live our entire life in that realm of thought, in the cranium, and we lose complete contact with the subtle energy and field of the body from the neck down, then we lose access to some part of what in the West we might call our soul. And in Buddhism, we don't use those terms. It'd be the citta or the heart, but we lose access to our heart. And so frequently that heart is what can direct us. And sometimes it's just a vague intuition, but other times it's a very clear voice, even if it's quiet. And sometimes it's a very loud voice. But more often it's quiet. And I remember speaking to a nun I knew in Spokane, and I asked her what had kept her in robes. And she said, we have this thing we refer to as the voice of God inside us, the personal God. And eventually that just became more important than anything else in my life. And because that voice is so often speaking to us quietly, only if we come back into our bodies and come back in contact with our hearts and dedicate time to quiet every day can we really hear it constantly and consistently through our day, and can it guide us. And you know when you yourself or when you meet others who have just not made space for that in their lives or their hearts anymore, and they've lost access to something so deeply important. So just to say that this instruction to become aware of the breath, it's not a dry thing. You're coming into contact and embodying again these subtle energies and this somatic field, and with the voices of your better and more subtle nature. So one uses these skillful means to come back into the body. And other visualizations one can imagine light pouring in through the crown of the head and streaming down the spine and out the soles of the feet. And then into the crown of the head, over the shoulder blades and out the hands. And then into the crown of the head to the throat, breathing in through the base of the neck, coming to the chest or diaphragm. And then breathing in through the point about 2 finger breadths above the navel. And just repeating that visualization, and that'll draw the awareness slowly down. And this is how you play with the body, and you begin to get a feel for it. And as you move awareness around the body, you'll notice a lot of things. Like in certain places there's knots, say at the base of the stomach where fear is, or in the throat. And similarly, you'll notice other things. For example, one side of the body will frequently be numb and the other side won't. And the next step of the Ānāpānasati Sutta, step 4, is to breathe in and out, training thus, I will calm the bodily activity. Kaya sankarang pasambayang. And these knots that we encounter in the body, these sort of formations, as we begin to feel them one can really consciously relax them and relax that knot. And you can do that a few things. You can just touch it gently or hold it in awareness, or even imagine that same light or mist coming in and out of that spot and just massaging it and relaxing it. And similarly, as one expands awareness to hold the whole body, but also keeping track of the breath at one point at the same time in the periphery, then the sensation of what we call the breath energy will, will become more and more prominent. And one will feel the breath energy, or might, flowing up the spine, down the front of the body, or up the front of the body, down the spine, naturally. And that sensation of having to force the breath to move by expanding and contracting the lungs or the body becomes less and less. And one can just let that movement relax. And that's another way of interpreting this idea of calming the bodily activities. Just let the breathing relax and let the breath move naturally as an energy. And as one is doing this, one also, it's a strange paradox in that the field of awareness is becoming broader, but at the same time, one is becoming centered more and more on that one point, say at the nose, and tracking the breath very subtly and continuously as you would a silk thread. And you pay more and more attention to that space between the in-breath and the out-breath, or between the out-breath and the in-breath. And that's how you begin to intuit more and more this subtle energy flowing around the body. Sometimes the mind will oscillate between those two. It'll move in very subtly to that tip of the nose and just want to be there, and then it'll expand out again and hold the whole field of the body in awareness. And you can just let it move back and forth. And eventually this subtle energy that flows around the body will refresh and nourish one, and one will feel it. The word for this sort of refreshment is piti, P-I-T-I, and it means this refreshing energy, and that will really nourish all the parts of the body that have been starved for so long. And this is step 5. One breathes in and out, sensitive to refreshment, to rapture. And the analogy the Buddha gives for this is a cool lake with no inflows to the north, south, east, or west, but fed by a spring of cool water from below and occasional showers from above that pervade the lake until no part of it was unpervaded with that cool water. Just so one pervades this body with the rapture and pleasure born of concentration. So it's a sense of upwelling of this subtle and refreshing energy. I'm wary of going farther. There's a lot there already, to be honest. So perhaps that's enough to speak to in terms of the meditation and the mindfulness of breathing specifically. But I think that this idea of play is important at the beginning. And in Buddhism, there's these terms called the defilements, which are these taints of the mind. And so frequently, when one gets a meditation object, say a really useful phrase of metta, the defilements will block it. It'll work for a day or two, and then it'll stop working completely. And the beautiful thing about accessing the body in this robust form of meditation is that over time, even if the defilements block certain methods of approaching the body, there's so much there. It's such a wide landscape that there's almost always a route towards calm there. There's almost always a way of approaching it or visualizing that works. So after the breath, we can speak a little more to it. After this breath energy has circulated, the next step is breathing in and out sensitive to pleasure. And this is the sense of being nourished, of the body feeling satiated and still. And the image the Buddha gives for the third jhana, which seems to echo this state in a lot of ways, is of a pond of cool lotuses submerged and pervaded with cool water. And in this image, there's no movement. Whereas with the lake, there's this upwelling of cool water. With the lotuses, everything is completely still. And this is the step 6 of the Ānāpānasati sutta, is just a sense of pleasure pervading the body. And one really absorbing into that and feeling it. And the breath is always there in the periphery. But when this happens and one has that wide field of awareness, frequently this is when a nimitta, a sign of light, will come into the mind. So one will feel one's visual field brightening steadily. Or one will, if one has cultivated the sound of silence, which is a subtle ringing or hissing in the ears, that's always there if you learn how to listen to it, then that'll become very prominent. And it's this very subtle and stable sense that comes. And the next step is one becomes sensitive to mental activity, and then one calms mental activity. And my sense is that when this bright awareness begins to pervade, and one really allows one's self to absorb into that and be pervaded by it, then it's as if the mind is a canvas, a white template, and all the thoughts and perceptions which we usually have and orient ourselves around with are so much writing or calligraphy on that canvas. And so as this bright sense of luminosity or pleasure develops, that's stable and wide and all-encompassing, begins to grow, then all this writing on the canvas becomes more and more prominent and then begins to fade. And it doesn't always fade naturally because we're so used to orienting ourselves by these subtle perceptions we hold in mind almost subconsciously of, say, the landscape of the body, or sort of the way we conceptualize our world, that it can be very disorienting when those things begin to feel like too much. And so that's when it can be really helpful just to let the meditation become very simple. And you let go of all these concepts of the body and the breath moving in a circuit, or of pleasure or sukha, and just remain with that wide field, bright, pleasurable, and with that one point of the breath at one place, just really letting the mind rest and become stable in that continuously without break, really trying to make it so there's no break between the inhale and the exhale. And when the mind becomes that bright and the canvas becomes pure, it is as if the next step of the Ānāpānasati sutta comes naturally, which is to become sensitive to the mind. And in many ways, I think of that canvas as the mind. And one then gladdens the mind. And so this is the interesting thing, is that when all these perceptions and things fade and the mind becomes very calm and subtle, then it can be very disorienting. And it can feel like a blank void that one has just stepped into, or as if one has climbed to the top of a mountain and suddenly it just flails around. And so what's so helpful then is to brighten the mind in accordance with the step and drop in a thought of loving kindness or metta. So just may I be well, or may someone be well. And it's as if one has dropped a bead of golden dye onto that canvas. And because the mind is so clean and pure and ready, then the gold dye pervades the whole scope of the mind very quickly and easily. And that one thought of metta or of love quickly brightens everything. And I think that's enough for the first timers here and for everyone else, including me. So I'm sorry, it's a lot. But I think really approaching the breath, it doesn't have to be all of these steps, but just even those first 4 or 5 of just learning to tether the mind to the breath, adjusting it so it's comfortable, then playing around, trying to find a way to get the mind to drop into the lower part of the body so that one can be with one's heart again. And then just letting things calm down and really keeping an eye out for those subtle energies which nourish and feel nourishing and refreshing. That's enough. And if one can get that much, then meditation can become deeply sustaining, and one can learn to play again. And this sort of broad lantern awareness becomes more and more accessible, and the lantern grows. Ajahn Sucitto, a teacher in our tradition, says that 80% of the practice at the beginning is just watching the heart become brighter. And that so much of what we're doing is because the flame of our heart and of our awareness is constantly being battered by the wind of what we want and don't want, of our movement, of our neuroses, of our desires, then it's like a sputtering flame. And what we do in meditation is we just hold it for a time in stillness and let it grow naturally brighter and brighter. And I think what this mind and heart looks like when it's bright, we can really sense in people, especially kids. You know when you see in a child that what we call the chitta, bright. It's sort of a golden light almost, an intuition, that sort of spontaneity and that agility. And you see how in your own life, at least for me, that fall from grace as we grow older, that light just gets dimmer until it seems like we're living life through a plane of plexiglass and things become numb. And what we're doing in meditation is you're just letting that golden flame grow again and reacquainting yourself with what is simultaneously the most innocent part of ourselves and also the strongest. And so this isn't sort of a dry practice. It can sound like that when I lay it out like steps or when one of the Buddha's many lists, but all we're doing is coming back to our hearts, essentially. And we're learning to reacquaint ourselves with the deepest and most personal and beautiful part of our being. And that is something that is worth 30 minutes a day or 20 minutes a day if you can put aside that time. It's even worth like 2 hours a day if you really want to do that too, but that's a little hard. It's at least worth 5 minutes a day. So, thanks for bearing with the long talk, and we have enough time to ask some questions now or speak. Sure. Yeah, and if people want to stretch their legs and stand up, you can. It's a long time to sit, but if we now have time to discuss and have some questions, and we can do that for a few minutes, and then yeah, so anyone online can also ask questions, and we have people there to read them, I suppose. So it doesn't have to be on the topic of the talk. It can be on anything, including why I dress like this, etc. It's all okay. So. Yeah, I apologize for those just coming to something like this the first time. This is like, it's a lot. I'm sorry. Okay, good.
I would like to ask, why do you wear
Well, there you go. That's good. So one of the people here just asked why I wear what I wear, and yeah. So uh, the Buddha, the Buddhist monastic order is 2,500 years old, and um, the robes uh, are supposed to be a very simple garb. In the time of the Buddha, they would be, because cloth was very difficult to come by, so they just take scrap cloth, frequently from dead bodies, which is the only place you could kind of find spare cloth back then. We don't do that as much anymore, although some monks have. But the idea is that it's a very simple, easy cloth to procure, and a huge part of our duty as monastics is to be easy, is to not be a burden on people, and to walk lightly. And um, so it's partly that, and it's partly to serve as a symbol of something else, of another path. And not in a conceited way or anything like that, but just that in the world we have so many symbols and figures pointing to, and whether we know it or not, we do imbibe and absorb what our culture is constantly telling us is worthwhile. And for a lot of us, I don't think most of us know that Tesla is not going to make us happy. But in terms of, say, you know, many other experiences, world travel, other things, status, like these do sink deeply into the heart because it's what's held up. And to have some figure or institution in society that points to some other sort of happiness, and very visibly so, uh, is important because it signals that, and um, so that's why we wear something that makes us stand out so much, is because it's supposed to be the symbol of a spiritual path. And not that everyone's supposed to become a monk or will become a monk or a nun, but just that there's a place in society for a reminder of that every day. And if we don't have that, I think it really does affect, like whether we know it or not, we all have our shrines. We have what's on the highest shelf of most houses is the liquor. What occupies the huge table in the living room is the television. Like, and on the television, there's very strange rituals going on. There's football games. Like, that is a really strange ritual. You know, um, so we have our rituals, we have our symbols, and we do absorb them. So much of this path is just acknowledging that and beginning to lift up what deserves to be lifted up. So I think something really beautiful to do is whether or not one is Buddhist, dedicating the highest place in one's house, or even just a whole room if one can, to practice, and whatever symbol that is for one, whether it's Christ or the Mother Mary or, you know, um, I don't know, Ganesh, sure. I don't know many Ganesh worshippers, but they're, oh, no, fair enough. And actually, there's plenty of Hindus out there, exactly. So, but some sign of love, and really elevating that in life, that's worth a lot. So, yeah. And honestly, I think one of the most powerful things to do is right on waking up to, most Westerners don't like to bow to things, but, us Buddhists love to bow. So, bowing to, for me, it would be an image of the Buddha, just as a recollection of something transcendent in the heart, no matter what form that wears. But I think right on waking up, even just repeating an intention for the day, like, may I walk today with grace and love. You know, there's such power in those little things. And I think we've let go of that a bit. So that's all a long way to say that, monastics are supposed to be one sort of very visible sign in society. So we're supposed to stand out. And we do. So, yeah.
That explanation is awesome.
Yeah.
So a follow-up to that is about, why do you bear your right shoulder?
So the question is, why do I bear my right shoulder?
Is that a political statement?
Don't know what that political statement would be. So when I go out into public, I actually am supposed to cover both shoulders. But in the Buddhist time, the right arm and hand were considered clean because should I go into this? I think everyone sort of gets it. Okay, right hand is clean; it's what you eat with. Left hand in these cultures is not. So this is sort of one symbol of respect. And you'll notice I'm sitting with the Buddha on my right side. And in the West, I think we understand how internal feeling affects external action. You care for someone, so you show them love. What I think we've lost is the logic behind ritual, which is that external action affects internal. So when we bow, over time, something in you does change, and you begin to really deeply feel that respect towards what you bow towards. Or if you keep what in Buddhism we refer to as the 5 precepts: not killing, not stealing, not engaging in sexual misconduct, not lying, not taking intoxicants. After 3 years of not killing, and like of almost smashing that spider, but then being like, no, I can't smash the spider. After 3 years of that, you start to think the spider's a little bit cute. It's really strange. Like, I lived with a spider about this big in my bathroom in Thailand for like a year. And you kind of name it after a while and it gets kind of cute. But because you've restrained it, the impulse to kill again and again and again, something in your heart does change. And similarly, when you have all these little signs of respect, when I bare my right shoulder, when I'm near a Buddha image, when a Catholic bends to the rosary, when someone, lights a candle for someone in their life who's died, it does affect you over time. And that's the logic of ritual that we've forgotten about. And we don't really have those rituals anymore, which is sad because we've lost that very concrete way of changing our hearts somewhat.
So Dave says, to Nisabho, so then the tetrads practice should ideally lead to inner silence and soul concentration on the breath-body awareness with no internal verbalizing. Simple is better, ?
Okay, so someone just asked the tetrads online, the tetrads, which are the steps of the Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta, should ideally lead to a state where inner verbalization ceases and one is just remaining with the breath in a very calm way. Less is better. Is that about right?
Mm-hmm. Simpler is better.
Simpler is better. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so the image the Buddha gives, I referenced the images of the lake and of the pond of lotuses. But the image the Buddha gives for the first jhana, which is a state of concentration in Buddhism, and it doesn't totally parallel exactly over the sutta, but I find there's interesting resonances. The image the Buddha gives for that jhana is a bathman or bathman's apprentice kneading water into a ball of bath powder, which is sort of what they used as soap back in the Buddha's day. It was like flour that you knead water into until it becomes dough, until no part of that ball of bath powder is unpervaded by that moisture. Even so, a practitioner kneads and pervades this body with the rapture born of seclusion until no part of this body is unpervaded. So, in this analogy, the 2 hands are what are called in Buddhism vitakka vichara, directed and sustained thought, which is applied perception. It's how we talk to ourselves or use images on ourselves. So it can be something as simple as, okay, now I'm going to expand awareness to the whole body. And it might just be the word whole body, whole body. Or it could be this image of light coursing down through the crown of the head and down to the soles of the feet. Or the image of the whole body of awareness as a bubble, in and out of which a white mist nourishes. Those are all applied thought. It's all very active, and one is getting involved, and one is kneading in this pleasure into the body. It's the bathman and the apprentice. That's applied thought. Evaluation, which is what's paired with it, is tasting it. How does it feel? What does it do to one? How is it? It's usually compared to ringing a bell and then listening to the ring. And as one gets calmer, you need to ring the bell less and less. So one applied perception, say one of these images, will just resonate for much longer. And so you can kind of step back, like every few breaths, direct oneself or apply a perception. And for Westerners, frequently it's helpful to phrase that direction as a question because it's gentler. So can I remain with the breath? How does the breath feel? And the chitta, the mind, and the body respond naturally. And eventually, I spoke about that point where one is aware of the mind and then just drops in a thought of metta and it pervades. That's sort of the extreme example of a point where the mind is so calm that even just a small ringing of the bell, a small moment of directed thought will resonate really powerfully. So the vichara, the evaluation, will resonate, and one will really taste it. The idea, though, is that actually after the first jhana, or after these initial stages of concentration, the directed thought and evaluation sort of fade away. And once again, this doesn't overlay perfectly these steps, but which is why I say there is still room every now and again to
mix that they